Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, how are you?
Great. Well, I'd just like to welcome everyone to our panel. This is a very important panel, and dealing with wounded warrior issues, it's very near and dear to all of the members of this panel's hearts, and I think I want to quickly introduce everyone, but then I want to get into the issues, and then we'll take questions for about 20 minutes at the end. So first, let me introduce Secretary of the Army John McHugh, appointed by President Obama in 2009. He oversees an annual budget of $200 million a year, leads a workforce of 1.1 million active duty reserve and guard personnel, not to mention the 200,000 civilian personnel, 200,000 contractors. He's a former congressman from New York, served on the House Armed Services Committee before being appointed to this current position. And then we have Congressman Jeff Miller, a Republican from Florida, the great state of Florida, chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. He has authorization and oversight for the VA with its 300,000 employees, its $150 billion budget, serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, as well. He is a former deputy sheriff, and he is now policing the VA for us. Then we have General Corelli, former Vice Chief of the Army. He oversaw the day-to-day operations of more than 147,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. He was the senior military advisor to Secretary of Defense Bob Gates from 2007 to 2008. He retired in 2012, and since then he's been the CEO of One Mind Research, which is an independent nonprofit that is dealing with studies of the brain. He has been an advocate for the destigmatization of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injuries. So welcome. Thank you, General Corelli, for being here. We have former Deputy Defense Secretary Rudy DeLeon. He was essentially the Chief Operating Officer of the DoD, appointed by President Clinton, served until 2001. He is currently at the Center for American Progress and a member of the Defense Policy Board since 2009. And he was on the QDR in 2010, so thank you for being with us. And finally, my dear friend Gary Sinise, who has done so much to advocate for veterans for the last 30 years. He is a modern-day Bob Hope. Since his iconic role as Lieutenant Dan Taylor in Forrest Gump, the Hollywood movie, he has taken on veterans' issues in a way that is so incredible. In 2004, he started his Lieutenant Dan Band. He performs at least 50 shows a year for veterans charities, fundraisers, military bases. And just 2 years ago, he started the Gary Sinise Foundation, and he's building smart homes for wounded warriors. And it is an incredible honor to have you all here with us today. Thank you. I just want to start by talking a little bit personally about how I got involved in wounded warrior issues. At the Pentagon, from my perch at the Pentagon, I'm the national security correspondent for Fox. I did a story a year ago that really changed my life. It was a story on a triple amputee by the name of John Peck, Sergeant Peck. And we were doing a story on this new device that he had requested from one of the nonprofit groups. It's called a track chair. And if you haven't seen it, it's a wheelchair, mechanized wheelchair, that has tank treads on it and allows these severely injured amputees to get back out into nature. They get to go back out to, their normal wheelchairs would get stuck in a normal circumstance. And they go hunting with these, they go to the beach. And John was the first one to request one of these track chairs. And we realized at the Walter Reed Christmas party last year that there were many people who wanted and needed. Of the 1,800 severely injured amputees, there were many, hundreds, who wanted these chairs. And so we started raising money for them. They cost about $15,000 a piece. But what we were finding is that these amputees were requesting these mechanized wheelchairs from the VA. The VA is supposed to provide one mechanized wheelchair to amputees, but they were turning them down for these requests. And we were finding that these chairs really changed their lives. So in the last 8 months, we got Bill O'Reilly on board, and he started raising money on his show, and we've bought about 250 of these chairs, and it's been very, very powerful. But it's drawn my attention to the fact that the VA is the second largest budget in our government, $156 billion. They spend more than $400 million a day. So the work that Gary's groups and there's been a proliferation of nonprofits dealing with wounded warriors in the last decade of war. And what struck me is that as much as, let's say one of these wounded warrior groups has a gala that raises $500,000 on a good night for their annual fundraising, it would take them 800 years to make the amount of money that the VA has to spend on one day for wounded warrior issues and for veterans. That's incredible. And that puts into perspective what we're talking about in terms of, A, we have this incredible need. We have 50,000 wounded warriors in the last decade of war. We have 1,800 amputees. We have an estimated 300,000 traumatic brain injuries, an estimated 500,000 post-traumatic people dealing with post-traumatic stress. These numbers are overwhelming, and if we look out to 2025, where are we going to be in terms of how do we make sure and ensure that these wounded warriors don't fall through the cracks, that they get what they need, and that society is not overwhelmed with their issues? So I'd like to start with the panel. We're going to go down the panel. Everybody's going to speak for about 1 to 2 minutes. And I just start with the question of, what is the greatest challenge you see right now from your perch in dealing with wounded warrior issues?
Well, I guess I
yes,
start.
Start with you, please.
Good to be here.
Secretary McHugh.
Chairman, nice to see you. I think you framed it pretty well. The challenge is simply the depth and breadth of the issues that we see. Some of it, I would argue, is really predicated upon good news. We're recognizing the kinds of psychological injuries that were never recognized previously, or if they were recognized, they weren't treated properly. Medicine on the battlefield, certainly on the positive side, have returned warriors that by all reasonable measures would have perished on the battlefield before. But the challenge and the result that we're struggling with are the great numbers of folks who are affected, the wide range of their afflictions, and frankly, a lot of good intentions, but in terms of issues like TBI, PTS particularly, not yet enough hard information on how to affect the most positive treatment. We have ways in which we're approaching these things. We've shown great results, but still we have a long ways to go. So it's really the dimension, the depth and breadth of making sure that all these terrific warriors, and their families, by the way, are cared for in the most effective manner possible.
Congressman Miller.
I think the most important thing that folks need to remember is that providing for those that have worn the uniform is, in fact, one of the costs of going to war. A lot of people in the public in particular don't realize that these costs continue long after the last shot is fired. While today we focus on the last 12 years of war and conflict with this nation, we are still taking care of those who fought on battlefields long ago. We lost our last World War I veteran just a few years ago, but we still have World War II veterans. The Department of Veterans Affairs is still providing for families of Civil War soldiers. And I think what focused a lot of people's attention during the recent shutdown of the government, when the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs came to our committee and said, the good news is I have $2 billion sitting in my account. The bad news is if we don't reopen the government by the end of that month, we will not have the $4.5 billion that it takes to provide the earned benefits to those that have worn the uniform. And so, as the Secretary has already alluded to, acknowledging the fact that the wounds that many of our service members suffer from are not visible. They're not the amputees. They are those that suffer from PTS, and certainly the signature wound from traumatic brain injury, of which General Corelli is so very involved.
And that's a perfect segue. General Corelli, tell us about your experience.
Well, I don't get an opportunity to do this in retired life that often, so I'll cut right down to a couple of recommendations that I would make based on my experience over the last 18 months. First of all, I got into this because I thought all I would really have to do is go and raise a lot of money and throw it at some researchers, and they would find a way to help people with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. But what I found is I often joke with folks, a place that's less efficient than the Pentagon, and that's how we conduct medical research in this country. Particularly in the area of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, because they're such difficult problems. They're not easy problems like the heart, the lungs, a broken bone. They deal with the brain, the true essence of who we are. Two things that, just to kind of kick it off, that I have found out in the last 18 months that would really, really assist wounded warriors is, number one, have a single drug formulary between the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration. In order to save money, both these organizations do the right thing, is they contract out for their drug formulary. But when those formularies are filled, they're different. So if anybody has ever dealt with anyone with post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury, one of the hardest things is getting them on the right drugs. And we go through this long process in DOD to get them on the right drugs, only to go ahead and medically discharge them or they retire from the service and send them into the VA. It has a totally different set of drugs. And they either go out and get a civilian doctor to write a prescription, or they go through the entire process again of going on to what are some very, very difficult drugs. These aren't drugs where somebody gives you a pill and says, try this, and if it works, you're good to go. If it doesn't, we'll give you another one tomorrow. These are drugs that you have to be weaned on and weaned off. The other thing that I would do, and I would argue that not only would that help our wounded warriors, but it would also save us a heck of a lot of money, because the buying power of DOD and VA together would be so much greater than it is if they did it separately. And it's not because one set of doctors believe one drug is better than another drug. The next thing, and it's pretty simple, is I would not give another single research grant where I did not have in place a data sharing agreement that ensured that the data that's collected from the small research or the large research we do is shared with the general community. Right now, it's locked up. It's not available for researchers to look at. And the real key to this is to efficiently maximize the data that we collect through these research grants, pull it together, and using the great computing power we have today, do the analysis necessary to really get at these issues.
Thank you. Secretary de Leon.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all who are here in the audience listening to these comments, including the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, who devotes a tremendous amount of his time to this very important issue, and the Ranking Member of the Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, in the rear. I spent as much time on the Hill as I did in the Department of Defense as a staff director. So one of the things that I think that Chairman Miller has talked about is cultural change and how important it is to have that focus. So let me just do 4 quick bullets in my remarks to show how important cultural change is, and then to amplify what General Shirelli just said. Big change across 3 administrations, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, was to re-engineer the VA medical centers and to link them with major university teaching hospitals. Pittsburgh, it's the University of Pittsburgh. Vet Center at Sawtelle, it's UCLA. We could go to each major city and find that in the last 20 years, this combination between the big teaching hospitals and the VA has brought in young doctors, state of the art, into the VA. Long way to go, but that's one example of a cultural change. Second cultural change, how we get our wounded off the battlefield has dramatically changed. Used to be we'd have a small fleet of hospital planes, but with the arrival of the C-17, you were able to configure as much medical capability as you needed. And so the protocol in the field is to stabilize a patient and then using the air vac, getting them to one of the major medical centers, usually the ones that are in Europe, but a huge change in terms of the survivability of the man or woman who is wounded on the battlefield. So now what's the next big cultural change? General Chiarelli sort of hinted at it, I'll be more blunt. We need to break down the walls between the VA Medical Center and the military treatment facilities that the department runs, and have less of a bright line about who's a veteran and who's active duty, and instead use the state of excellence that exists at the new Walter Reed Bethesda or Madigan in the Northwest, or the new hospital down in the Norfolk area. We need to make both of these facilities accessible to the wounded warriors and move away from the notion that one day you're in the MTFs and the next day you're in the VA system. Because the MTFs, the military treatment facilities, are state of the art. Congress has given the department some tremendous tools on bringing in doctors and nurses from the best schools in the country and from the armed services medical institutes. And so we need to break those walls down between the DoD military treatment facilities and the VA hospitals so that they're more interchangeable, an amplification of what the general said. And then finally, I think, to Gary Sinise, we owe him a great debt, much in the way that the League of Families of the POW and MIA from Vietnam were huge voices for our POWs. And I think that through someone who is familiar in the public mind and well known, he's able to speak at places where those of us who speak at technical levels aren't. He's able to take this to the great American public, and his voice resonates. So I just want to acknowledge that. So
thank you.
2 minutes.
Okay, Gary?
Thank you, Rudy. Well, in response to that, why would somebody like me be on a panel like this? These are people in the field, these are people in the government, these are people working. I'm a volunteer who started a nonprofit out of concern for our military and our veteran community. I remember the State of the Union address in 2002, 4 months after September 11th, when President Bush asked every American to devote at least 2 years of his or her time, 4,000 hours or more over a lifetime to help fellow Americans and your communities. I heard that call and felt that there was a role to play in trying to create awareness, bring awareness, raise money, do whatever I could to help our service members. Having Vietnam veterans in my family, I remember all too well what it was like for our Vietnam veterans to come home to a nation that didn't appreciate them, that turned its back on them. It was a shameful period in our history. It weakened our nation, and in the 21st century, with the dangers that we faced, obviously we have to have a strong defense, and that means taking care of our warriors before, during, and after the battle. So as a citizen who benefits from the freedom provided by those who serve our country, I just felt there was a role to play. Now, having said that, as Rudy said, one of the roles that I can play is awareness about volunteerism and where the needs might lie, because I'm able to interact with the military community in a way that the average citizen doesn't get to do. And so I would just encourage volunteerism and awareness raising in this fight. These are all things that we're going to learn a little bit more about today. But what does that mean to the average citizen who's so totally disconnected from its military? The way Admiral Mullen said when he was leaving as chairman, he said one of his biggest fears was not that the citizens around the country aren't supportive of the military, but there was such a big disconnect between the military and the average citizen that was his biggest fear over the next while. And why should we care about our veterans? Well, I think just raising awareness and educating people as to why we should care about these issues is primary to motivating them to do something about it.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. General Corelli, let me start with you. You talked about this issue of drugs, and what we're seeing is that the cocktail of drugs that these wounded warriors are going on when they come through Walter Reed and then they enter the VA system, some of them are on a dozen drugs. We don't know how those drugs interact. Some of them are to go to sleep at night. Some of them are to wake up in the morning. Some of them are to deal with depression. Some of them have the opposite effect if they're taken in the wrong dosages, and they can become psychotic drugs. What are you seeing in terms of the prescribing of these drugs and how dangerous this is, because it's leading to antisocial behavior that is actually a threat to society right now and a threat to the warrior himself?
Well, Jennifer, I think quite frankly the services have done a much better job at controlling prescription drugs and ensuring that you have peer review when a service member goes over so many drugs. Again, I really think the issue is that the drugs that we prescribe for post-traumatic stress, when I was vice, I thought that they were all brought on board for post-traumatic stress. They're all 40 to 50-year-old antidepressants. We don't have a single drug that's been brought to market to help anyone with post-traumatic stress. So these are all off-label prescriptions that are done by doctors. And we really don't know what the effect is going to have on the individual, because so much of this is genetic. What we're seeing is even traumatic brain injury. The severity of what's going to happen to a person who is hit in the head is based on a very large extent on that individual's genetics. So one of the very first things, given how difficult it is to try to get people on the right drugs at the right time, and I think that that's one of the problems that I was trying to point to, would be to ensure that the drugs that are in the VA system and in the DoD system are the same. And both are doing the right thing by contracting out their formulary, but the amount of money that could be saved if we did a single formulary between the two agencies and then took away this transition that service members have to make when they go from one system to another, would go so far and save the government money. So I really think we understand, and the services have done a lot to get control of the number of drugs that are prescribed. I think we just have to get a little bit more efficient on how we transition from one system into the other.
Gary, what are you finding in terms of, you have a lot of one-on-one involvement with our wounded warriors, whether they're at Walter Reed or elsewhere. What are you seeing in terms of the drugs that they're on and the impact on the warrior?
You know, I was just at Walter Reed, I don't know, about a month ago. And after a dozen years of war, you know, we now have wounded warriors that have been living with their injuries for 10 to 12 years. And I happened to be there, and on my first visit to Bethesda and Walter Reed back in September 11th, 2003 was my first visit to the hospital. And I saw an Iraq injured veteran there that day who was just injured, newly injured, lost both his legs. And just this last trip, I saw him again at Walter Reed going through another series of surgeries after 10 years. He was much heavier now. He had been on various drugs for 10 years now. What's it going to be like 10 years from now, and 10 years from that, from just these Iraq and Afghanistan veterans? He was struggling. And I said, well, how have you been? What's been going on in your life? What have you been doing? And he told me the series of challenges that he's been through over the last 10 years. It didn't seem very hopeful for me, and that was discouraging, because you want, of course, that person 10 years ago to move forward, like Lieutenant Dan, you know, move forward, be successful in business, move on with their life, be okay. And yet I was discouraged by the fact that I saw one guy, and he's only one, who was, after 10 years, still on various drugs and still going through various surgeries.
What was his main complaint?
Jobs.
Jobs?
You know,
Yeah.
jobs, because of his condition, because of some of the issues he'd been on with various medications and everything. He just didn't have a lot of hope, and that was discouraging to me.
Congressman Miller, explain to us the VA backlog situation right now, where it stands. We've heard that progress was made since April, that the backlogs are down by a third, but yet the numbers are still extraordinarily high. I believe that it's something like 425,000 claims that are backlogged by more than 125 days. Explain to us the reality. First of all, why are they backlogged? And has there really been a drop in the backlog claims?
I question whether or not the number of claims that have been reduced is actually real. Number one, because many of the ratings that have been given over the last several months with the mandatory overtime that VA had put in place, which I think was a good thing, are provisional ratings. And the veteran, once they get that rating, still have the opportunity for 1 year after that rating is given to appeal that rating. So to the veteran, that means they're still backlogged. What happens within the Department of Veterans Affairs is once they give that rating, it actually comes off of their books, and so they're not counted as a backlogged veteran anymore. 400,000 individuals, though, waiting over 125 days is not acceptable to anybody. 300 days still is the average time that it takes to process and adjudicate a disability claim. Now, we've got all the great tools in place. Veteran Benefit Management System, which is the electronic system, which something that I hope we have an opportunity to talk further about, because there is still a disconnect between DOD and VA as it comes to electronic medical records. But the VA will tell you that the VBMS is the answer to the situation. I don't think that it's the whole answer. If we don't change the management of the resources the way that VA has been doing it, just because this is the way we've done it over the years, the backlog, I'm afraid, will grow back to the number of 700,000+ individuals waiting. We owe it to those that are putting the claims in to get them done right and to get them done on time. Surely there have been issues that have come to bear. The decision to add presumptions for Agent Orange was the right decision. But those are done, they're out of the way, they're not contributing to the backlog today. The complexity of the claim and the number of veterans making a claim is something that the VA will say is leading to the problem that exists today. But the very same excuses were used 20 years ago in budget submissions. So I've got to say that hopefully we can cross this great divide, change the management of the resources, because Congress has, even as long ago as when Secretary McHugh was in Congress, we provided every single resource that VA has asked for, every dollar, every person, every piece of equipment. We remain the most bipartisan committee on the Hill today because we want to do what is right. And so I'm hopeful that what we see in the press is actually a real reduction, because that's what we as Americans expect.
What is your greatest frustration with the VA? You were at a hearing, I believe, in Pittsburgh, in which they were talking about bonuses for VA officials in an area where there had been Legionnaire's disease.
Well, it's not just Pittsburgh. The incident that you referred to is Pittsburgh, where we had veterans who died because they contracted Legionnaire's disease in the hospital, and the administrators that were involved in that medical facility knew that the Legionnaire's disease was there, and one of them got a $63,000 presidential bonus. That's not right. Mental health is another provision where in Atlanta, veterans, and this is across the country as well, not just Atlanta, but unfortunately, veterans were given cocktails of drugs that were intended to help them that created greater problems for them psychologically and mentally, to the point that they committed suicide. And people that were in charge of the administration of that facility got bonuses because they've always given bonuses out as recruiting tools and retention tools. If somebody dies on your watch, you don't get a bonus. You get reprimanded, you get removed, you get fired.
Secretary McHugh, what is your experience with the VA? Where do you see the greatest issue right now between your department and trying to help those that are moving from the DoD system to the VA?
Well, the greatest issue, of course, is, as has been commented here today, to try to ensure that we are as seamless as possible, that as a soldier moves from care under the military treatment facilities, and in our case, of course, the Army to the VA, it's transparent to that soldier. Probably the biggest challenge functionally right now is the IDES, the Individual Disability Evaluation System. Congressman Miller just alluded to the VA portion of that. We're working very hard on the Department of Defense side to try to smooth out the kinks that have frustrated soldiers really since the beginning of the system. And I still believe it is well intended. It is to try to bring the two departments working more closely and effectively together. It had some rough startups. From the Army side, now virtually every component of the IDES process under our total control is being met within the DoD standards. As you mentioned, Jennifer, and as Jeff Miller just affirmed, the backlog on the VA side continues to be troubling. I've talked to Secretary Shinseki about this. He obviously is deeply concerned and is working it hard. We have, in the Department of Defense, tried to augment them personnel-wise. It becomes a matter of just moving the paper. And again, as the Congressman said, moving it in a way that is fair to the soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, and has the proper outcome. The VA estimates they'll have that backlog down to virtually zero by August of next year. We certainly hope that's the case and want to help support them. May I say a word about drugs?
Please.
Because that's a very important issue. And the comments about the two formularies, of course, is one, as I know my former colleague on the House Armed Services Committee, Jeff Miller, knows, is one of very complicated legislative provisions and access to Medicaid-priced drugs, et cetera. But nevertheless, when it comes to polypharmacy, multiple drugs, the department, I think, has really taken great strides in the right direction, recognizing the issue. Probably in the beginning years of the war, if a drug was available for a singular issue, it was administered without enough care, without enough oversight as to the effects of multiple drugs. But now we chart those things very carefully. If a soldier is under a polypharmacy issue, if he or she has a serious issue and is rated at risk, we have a sole drug provider. We're doing a better job working with the private providers outside the gate, because if a soldier, sailor goes out off the TRICARE system and procures a drug through another means at a private pharmacy, we really aren't aware of that. So we're working more carefully together. The other thing we're trying to do, always mindful of the fact that drugs are a wonderful thing when used in the proper ways, there are other methods, non-pharmacological methods by which we can treat these kinds of things. Everything from transcendental meditation to acupuncture to massage therapy, biofeedback, all of those kinds of alternative therapies for a great and growing number of wounded warriors is providing relief, not just from what ails them, but from the drugs that they were being treated with before. Long struggle still left, but I do think we've made pretty good progress. Thank you.
Secretary DeLeon, we've been hearing about troubles with the VA for decades. This is not new to these wars. From your perspective, where you sit, what is the problem and why hasn't it been fixed?
Well, I think one of the things is, we've gone through a series of reforms on the DoD side, particularly on the medical. We launched a dozen years ago something called the TRICARE system. It's been pretty successful in terms of retiree satisfaction. But one of the things in the DoD with the Surgeon Generals, there's constant work on making sure that the system is responsive, because occasionally guys like myself or the chairman or Secretary McHugh actually will go and sit in the lobby of some of these treatment facilities and just sort of sit there and have a coffee and see what you see. So I think the re-engineering on the VA side has always been a bit more frustrating. It's not that people aren't conscientious, it's just a different system. And so that comes back to if we can find a way to have more interaction between the two. Now, the pharmacy is a great place to start. I think General Chiarelli, he didn't want to say this, so I'll say this. You know, we still need some help on the R&D side, on the medical side, in terms of understanding the brain. We're good at trying to help mend the body, but mending the spirit is harder. And so because there are things we don't know, and this gets to the pharmacy as well, what are the right medications to give? And then a point that Gary Sinise made, for our wounded warriors and all of our warriors who are coming back, we've got to pick up the beat a bit further in terms of helping them get jobs. Because some of them come back, these are incredible leaders, but when they come back to their home, the jobs are short, and so they're, you know, helping mend the mind is having the right doctor and the right prescriptions. Helping mend the mind is also having valuable, worthwhile things to do, and so they're picking up the effort to help all of the warriors when they come back on the jobs front.
Great, thank you. And General Chiarelli, I just wanted to ask you, what have you found in terms of the treatment of PTS and TBI? What are some of the new innovations that you're seeing that are really working to get, I've heard something about magnetic imaging, there's a sort of electric shock treatment, there's a hypobaric chamber that's bringing oxygen to the brain. What's showing the most promise right now?
Well, I think the two that are showing the most promise are cognitive is number one. And I think it's been accepted by the VA as the standard of care in the VA for post-traumatic stress. And the other one is exposure therapy. They are the two. Now, there's a lot that are out in the fringes that work for folks, and I totally agree with Secretary McHugh. The fact of the matter is we have no way to diagnose someone and know which of the treatments is going to work. So it becomes very, very frustrating. I think the really difficult thing about this is we always quote numbers. I think the DOD quotes 265,000 since the beginning of the wars with traumatic brain injury, and you quoted the post-traumatic stress numbers. But those numbers are multiplied by a factor of 4 because these diseases affect families. And the real issue here is that what's so hard about it is, number one, many times the symptoms don't appear till after you've gone through your discharge physical, and now you have a problem. And the second thing that makes it so very, very difficult is the effects that it has on the families. That families live with this. We forget that when you have traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, you lose that thing that allows you as an individual to be your best advocate. You know, if you went into the hospital and said, "Doc, I think I broke my leg," and they asked you 17 questions like they ask you for post-traumatic stress, and you answered them and he said, "No, you haven't broken your leg," I think you'd probably say, "Well, Doc, don't you think it might be a good thing to give me an x-ray?" But the fact of the matter is, with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, if you're on your own, you're in there advocating, and that thing that allows you to be your best advocate when you're working with the medical profession doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So that's why this is so difficult. And I totally agree that what we really need is research, but we need research done in the right way. We need research done where people share data, not research where we grant somebody $100 million to study post-traumatic stress. They collect the data becomes theirs, and they don't share it with anybody. And that's really what we've got. NIH last year spent $84 million on a problem, a national problem that's $78 billion a year. That's the direct medical cost of traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury in this country is 3.4 million Americans a year. 3.4 million Americans. 265,000 soldiers over a 13-year period. This isn't a military problem. This is a national problem. Yet we spent $84 million on it. Now, since I've got out of the Army, I've found that any CEO that had a $78 billion problem that his R&D budget to fix it was $84 billion wouldn't be a CEO for very long. And what makes it even worse is that when we spend that money, we don't share the data. So people find out who went down the dead-end road, who has something that might work with something that somebody else has done. And in reality today, we have this tremendous capability to analyze data like we've never been able to analyze it before in computing power, and that's what it's going to take to understand the brain.
And what is exposure therapy for those who don't know?
Exposure therapy is to basically have somebody relive the event, the traumatic event that caused the problem they've got with their frontal cortex not working right and controlling the amygdala, which causes somebody to go into this heightened state of arousal for 6 to 8 hours. And what you're basically doing is putting them in a situation where they relive that over and over and over again. It's very, very painful, but they relive it over and over and over again, and finally the frontal cortex turns on and does the job it's supposed to do, and that's to regulate the amygdala, so those male hormones that cause you to go into this heightened state of arousal don't flow after you realize you're not in danger.
Fascinating. I think what I'd like to do right now is open it up to the audience for questions. You can, I think there's a microphone somewhere, and if you could come and if you raise your hand, I'll call on you and they'll bring a microphone to you, and you can tell us who you'd like to ask the question of and what your question is, okay? Great, let's start here. Thank you.
Good morning. Steve Myers. Your comments about what is not working, what the issues are, spot on. What I'm having trouble understanding is why these problems are persisting for so long. What is in the way from a programmatic standpoint of breaking through all of this and creating a system that works the way we all want it to work? I can't get my arms around what's in the way.
Congressman Miller?
Secretary Shinseki is a good and honorable man who wants to do the right thing. He has an agency that has 300,000 employees. The vast number of those people are hardworking individuals that are doing the right thing. But the mid-level of that agency, unfortunately, has been the thing that has grown the most over the years. And they know that they will outlast any secretary, they'll outlast any chairman of the VA committee, and they're just going to keep doing it the way they've been doing it. And that's tough for one individual as the secretary to go in and do what needs to be done. And they're prevented, unfortunately, from doing some things by law with the personnel. We've got to be more transparent in the process. Secretary McHugh talked about the transparency within the Department of the Army, within VA as well. And we've got to be willing to say, if you're not doing your job, there are a whole lot of people standing in line, Gary, as you said, other veterans in particular, that would take that position. What VA will do is if they find a physician, first of all, you know that you can't sue the physician at the VA. And over the last decade, over $800 million, has been spent on tort claims. But the doctor knows that he can continue doing what he's doing, or he gets moved to another facility. And I just think, folks within the system, and that's at that mid-level management system, have to understand they got to do it right. You bring in an undersecretary or a secretary, they're there for 4 or 5 years or 3 years or whatever the number is, and then they're gone. And these people are still there working.
And I think that's an important point, Congressman Miller, that the malpractice claims have skyrocketed against the VA, $800 million a year, and that's being paid by the Treasury, by the taxpayer, and that doesn't get talked about very much. Gary, what is your experience from the warrior's point of view, from the patient's point of view? Why is this not getting fixed? You've seen it for a dozen years. What are they telling you is the problem?
There's so many nonprofits that have sprung up in the last dozen years that are filling these enormous gaps in the system. And if you took these nonprofits away, Semper Fi Fund, Hope for the Warriors, some Wounded Warrior Projects, some of these others that have popped up and really tried to address the needs after the VA system or even within the issues of the VA system, I think we'd have a catastrophe on our hands, quite frankly. If there weren't nonprofits that are trying to do research, if there weren't nonprofits that are out there trying to, take up the charge where there are. And I've met, hundreds of these warriors who are being served by many of these nonprofits. I started my own because it just became clear to me that it was a natural progression of what I've already been doing, and that there was a need to be filled. We're filling all kinds of needs that certainly the VA system isn't filling. Why would you say, we had to provide 250 track chairs, we had to go on Bill O'Reilly's show and get him to talk about it, to raise $15 million to provide chairs, to provide independence for somebody with missing their arms and legs. Our government isn't going to do that. We'd have a real catastrophe on our hands if we didn't have some of these nonprofits that have stepped up. We have billions of dollars being wasted here and there, and like you say, ridiculous things. Bonuses for people that shouldn't be getting bonuses, while somebody can't get their medical care or whatever because they're fighting against the VA, when the VA should be fighting to find those people and address those needs. I had a Vietnam veteran brother-in-law who spent 5 years trying to get his benefits from the VA, trying to prove that he deserved those benefits. He crashed his helicopter in Vietnam and came home. Obviously, after Vietnam, it was very difficult. He tried to get a few things, felt it was too much, disappeared, and ended up drinking a lot and coming to live with us for 5 years. And we finally started taking him to try to get his benefits. It took us 3 years to get him through the VA system to be able to get, $40,000 a year or whatever it is in benefits. It seems it's just a constant struggle. It always has been. It's certainly better than it was 40 years ago after Vietnam, but it's a never-ending issue. And this bureaucracy of the VA and how much is wasted that could be applied. Give it to the nonprofits. We'll take care of it.
The nonprofits are getting it done because we've seen that, but at the same time, look at the budgets. We're talking about the two largest budgets in the U.S. government. It makes the DOD and VA make up 20% of the U.S. federal budget. And so something has to begin working a little more efficiently. Yes, Secretary McHugh.
May I return this to the DOD side, because these are very, very critical issues, and the gentleman asked a very, I think, reasonable, straightforward question. What can we do to make this work the way we would all like it? And I think that's important to know. We would all like it to work perfectly. Unfortunately, as imperfect human beings trying to care for people who have gone through the very imperfect circumstances, that's not always possible. But what we found ourselves on the DOD side facing was trying to balance our interest in doing it quickly against our interest in doing what was right for the wounded warrior. And those two things didn't always, nor do they still, work well together. We have come a long way toward placing the prejudice of doing the right thing on the soldier. In other words, we want to do the right thing by them. If there's a jump ball decision, it will go, if we have anything to say about it, to the favor of that wounded warrior. But it still gets very, very frustrating for us. And one of the good news side of this very challenging story is that, thank God, the people of this country today want to do more things in more ways to care for the wounded warriors who have left the military service than any other time in our nation's history. And that's why people like Gary Sinise and others who step forward, who fill those gaps of the American desire to do virtually everything and the inability of government to do that everything, I think over a longer term will really continue to reap benefits. But for those of us inside the structure, that I didn't just drop in on Walter Reed. I went so far as to fracture my pelvis and spend 22 days just to do an inside inspection. I mean, we are blessed with amazing people who get out there and provide care, who do the right thing. And we've got to match that kind of commitment on the floors of the MTFs that we see in support of those great people that they show every day.
Absolutely. Yes. Let's see. Let's wait for the microphone, which is coming. Great.
Good morning. Dennis Anderson, a military father, a son with PTS, TBI. I embedded in Phase 1, Phase 2, and General Chiarelli was there. And note who and how raised the issues of military suicides and that it is being confronted as the crisis that it is. To anyone germane on the panel, do you think there is effective tracking of suicide beyond the military? And I mean, these are guys who are out in the Guard or people who have experienced in-country, shifted out of the military. Is there any useful tracking being done on that? Is it enough? Can it be done better?
General Chiarelli, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, my own experience, and I'm dated by a year and a half, my own experience was we had really good numbers inside the military because anytime someone dies in the military, we send the same group of medical examiners out to make a death determination. You may disagree with the standards they use, but they use the same standards every time, and I felt very, very comfortable with those numbers. But once a guardsman demobilizes, and when he's mobilized, he's an active component soldier, and those same medical examiners go. But when he or she demobilizes, they go into the civilian community, and their standards are totally different between coroners. You know, it's the death determination is determined on a lot of factors, and some of it is pressure from families who don't want to know that Uncle Albert, you know, didn't have a heart attack when he left the car running in the garage and forgot to turn it off and died of asphyxiation. There's still tremendous pressure and stigma associated with suicide. So I never felt very, very comfortable with the numbers outside the military just because we had this huge advantage of being able to investigate every case with the same group of individuals who came up with a death determination.
And General Chiarelli, are the suicide numbers coming down?
I just read the DOD release the other day, and they are. It came down by, I believe, 27% across the department.
Secretary McHugh, can you explain why that's happening as far as you know?
Inside the active.
Well, the optimist in me would like to believe that after a decade of trying to do the very things and address the very issues that Pete Chiarelli just mentioned, the stigma that is associated not just with the act of suicide, but with, in the military, reaching out for help. Somehow the tradition had been, well, if you're not man enough to power through it, you're not man enough to be in this service. And we have spent a lot of resources, a lot of time and effort at all command levels particularly, but also in our basic training, teaching people it's okay to get help and not just okay, it's the right thing to do. We've also instituted on the Army side all kinds of stress relief, resiliency building programs, comprehensive soldier fitness, and others that we'd like to as well believe are having a positive effect on those numbers. The Army numbers were about 24% down from previous reports. The fact is, however, as much as we'd like to believe that at this point, while we hope this is a trend, we don't know if it's just a glitch in the data. This is something that rips at all our hearts. I sign condolence letters to every survivor, regardless of how that soldier dies, in battle, in a suicide, in a car wreck. Approximately half of all the letters I'm signing now are the result of suicide. To have a young soldier come back, getting through a deployment in Afghanistan with people out there really trying to kill them, and then lose their life like that is just heart-wrenching. And we're working this as hard as we can, but it's frustrating for all of us. And we have great data, as Pete Chiarelli said, but the gentleman's question, outside the standards of how they determine suicide or not, and the other data collection issues are not quite as certain.
Well, isn't there also, sorry, go ahead, General Chiarelli.
Is the legislation so difficult to get a single formulary that it can't be in some way fixed? Or as a stopgap, at least take those drugs that are prescribed in the DOD system and ensure that VA carries that limited number of antidepressant drugs, pain drugs that are so habit forming.
Pete, I will defer to Congressman Miller, and then I'm a recovering congressman. He's an active one. But I can tell you it's been tried in the past, and it was very difficult to do. I'm not justifying it. Please don't misunderstand me. I was on the other side, and it would be a great effectiveness and efficiency, save us a lot of money, but therein raises the issues. So I think it's something we ought to continue to press for.
Congressman Miller.
I think, I never wore the uniform, so I was not part of the military system. And it's amazing to me to see the difference from DOD to VA. That there is a difference. People like to talk about a seamless transition from one to the other. There's not. It's kind of a hot handoff. DOD says you are no longer part of us, which is amazing to me. At least that's the impression that I get. You are now a veteran, and the Department of Veterans Affairs needs to take care of you. And that is a true statement. We have to be able, we try to do medical facilities, joint medical facilities right now. I went in the hospital in the Air Force Hospital in Las Vegas. This was supposed to be a great testimony to jointness. And you walk in and they say, now the veterans are in Wing A and the active duty are in Wing B. That's not what we would expect to see. I'd like to be able to go into a facility and not be able to tell which is which. And the formulary question, General, is a tough one. Everybody wants to solve it, but you have to have a willingness to be able to do it. And I'm willing to take on that charge as a member of both committees, because I think it's very, very important. But back to your question, sir, about suicide, over the last decade, the numbers haven't changed in the veteran community. 22 veterans a day commit suicide in this country. We do not do a very good job of tracking them, and unfortunately within the Department of Veterans Affairs, they are not able to provide mental health care within the system as timely as it should. And so there's a lot of us that believe you should be able to go outside the system into the private sector to be able to do it. But when that happens, you're still VA's responsibility. Even if I've handed you off to a private provider, it's VA's responsibility to make sure that you're being cared for. Atlanta in particular, we had 2 vets, unfortunately, that were in private hands that did commit suicide, and really the VA in Atlanta didn't know about it, didn't know the cause of it, and we've got to stop that as well.
Let's take another question here. Yes?
My name is Dan Caldwell. I'm a college professor who is trying to provide better services for veterans in higher education. But my question relates to Secretary McHugh and General Corelli's reference to families. I've read reports that family members are now suffering from PTS, and I'm wondering what the Department of Defense and the VA are doing for family members who have PTS.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. All of us, certainly I do, when you think of PTS, you think of that as occurring in a kinetic environment. In other words, things are blowing up, people are shooting at you. Certainly that's the case, but about 20% of all PTS diagnoses within the military comes from families and/or soldiers who had never been deployed. And my understanding is there's a relatively significant number of civilians just out here walking the streets each and every day who, when exposed to a particularly traumatizing event, can develop PTS. From the Army side, what we've attempted to do through a variety of family support programs is to provide mental health counseling opportunities, including for children. We have a brave Strong Families program to try to assist parents to recognize troubles amongst their child, teach them how to talk to their children to address these issues, and provide, if necessary, for both the parent and the child, the necessary mental health counseling and whatever other treatment could assist them in overcoming that event. That's probably not as robust as we would all like right now. It's not as mature as some of our other efforts, but the good news is we have recognized it. And as I mentioned, and it has to be more than a bumper sticker, we talk about the Army family. And it's very, very important to us, and that importance has to be reflected in the breadth and depth of our programs, and recognizing that when a wounded warrior comes home, in many ways the struggle of that soldier is just beginning, but clearly the struggle for the family. And that's something that in prior generations I don't think was recognized well, but it brings challenges and burdens, and those are the kinds of things we're trying to do to address them.
I would just add that we speak of PTS the same way we try to speak of a broken bone or cancer or a heart attack. It's a finite thing that we can diagnose. We can't. Our ability to diagnose post-traumatic stress is not very good. Under DSM-4, which is a psychiatric manual, it's a series of 17 questions. In DSM-5, it went to 20 questions. I could hand you those 20 questions, and I promise, without staying up all night, you could take a test tomorrow morning and you could get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. We don't have any blood biomarkers. There's a raging debate going on right now about our ability to image it in the amygdala. But like many of these things, until we can get large-scale trials going, so the people who say, well, wait a second, that thing that you see, that change in the amygdala, we don't know if that had not occurred prior to the traumatic experience somebody went through. Once we're able to do things like have blood biomarkers, image it, we will turn a huge corner in really understanding what the problem is and being able to separate it from such things as personality disorder, a number of depressions. But right now today, our ability to diagnose is really, really, really in the dark ages. And that's why we're pushing so hard to try to rationalize research to give us the diagnostics first, which will ultimately lead to the treatments. And get the pharmaceutical companies back into the game here and the device companies back into the game and helping us out, because they basically all pulled out. It's just too high risk for them to do any of these drugs. They can't get them to market in the 20 years needed to do so. So they're basically not doing research.
And the other interesting thing is that post-traumatic stress shows up 6 months or a year after leaving combat. It's not like you come home, you do your questionnaire, you answer your questions, and it can show up later. So, okay, next question, yes.
Good morning. I'm Judy Cooperberg from Mental Health America, one of those nonprofits. And the Congress was very wise in funding SFVF, supportive services for veteran families, in 2011. And we were fortunate to get one of those grants with the VA. So as a community-based organization, we're able to help homeless families, veteran families, and families that are at risk of homelessness. In the last 2 years, just my agency in the Antelope Valley, which is the northernmost part of Los Angeles County, we've served about 350 families. Just this month, in our third year, the start of our third year of funding, we've served 90 families. And so the homeless rate is growing drastically with the veteran population. Not every veteran lives in a cosmopolitan or metropolitan area. We are 70 miles away from the VA. So to expect veterans to go from the Antelope Valley to Westwood for specialty services, especially mental health services, it's not happening. We heard that mental health services were going to be contracted out to CBOs, just like the SFVF program was. It hasn't happened. So we have a lot of veterans who are suffering in the rural areas, or I like to say urban and rural. They're not getting those services. So is there any time in the near future that those funds are going to be released to the CBOs?
I would say that VA is looking at a number of ways in which to treat mental health where the veteran wants to be treated and basically from whom they get treated. The interesting thing, telemed telemedicine is becoming a new wave of the future for veterans, in particular, the younger veterans of today. It's very difficult for World War II veterans, some of them, and some Vietnam veterans, to talk to a provider via a screen. But I'm finding out as I ask questions that people are really taking to it and understand that there's a human interaction between individuals. And it's not just mental health as well. But that's why I say that in the past, VA has always tried to push the veteran to the facility that they own. Veteran service organizations support that because I think they're afraid that if you break that paradigm, then you're going to break the VA, take the VA down brick by brick. That's not true. You as a nonprofit provider, people that are in the business of giving mental health care are there in the local communities, and sometimes they know best. And so I live in a rural area, and I'll be honest, a great number of our veterans, when they come home, want to go to a rural area and live. And we have to be more nimble at being able to provide it. And we are trying to work with VA to get them to understand that we've got to go where the veteran lives, not make the veteran come to us. And we provide, obviously, 55 cents a mile for them to be able to go to their, and some veterans want to do that. But the vast majority, I would think, want to receive the care at home and not have a 2 or 3 hour commute to a VA facility.
Good. We have enough time for about 2 more questions. So,
Hello.
right here.
My name is Ken Robinson. One of the things I'd like to comment on is data that you spoke of earlier, Congressman and General Torelli. The Congress of the United States passed a law that said that pre-deployment testing so that we could establish a baseline on soldiers should be done across the force. And there's no compliance with that. So there's marginal compliance in certain places, but across the force it's not being done. And that one area will give at least science and medicine an opportunity to establish a baseline of where this soldier started as he comes back on the other end. One of the other challenges is, as you said, oftentimes, and I've been going to Afghanistan for 13 years, embedding, and I've been going to these hospitals. And what happens is, and I can't tell you the number of times I've watched it, they'll stand and say, there's the plane that's going to take you home. There's the line for solving your medical problems before you redeploy. That plane's leaving pretty soon. That line's going to keep you here about another week. Here's a piece of paper. Are you okay, or do you need to get in that line? And many of these soldiers sign the piece of paper to get on the plane. And then what happens is when they get home, and then they make a VA claim, because a lot of times, as we know, sometimes this pre-deployment stuff doesn't present. The PTSD presents once they get back on the ground. And then they're into a challenge with the VA who says, you didn't complain. We have it right here. When you were at Bagram, you said you were good to go. That's a cultural thing that we have to fix that I believe deserves a lot of attention. The other one that you spoke of that I really want to echo and highlight is when you talked about the Veterans Administration itself. Because we had one of the finest generals that this Army has produced run that place, and we still haven't been able to fix it. And that should be a wake-up call to everyone about that problem you described. And I think the only way to seriously solve it, and I want to offer it as a serious suggestion, is move the Veterans Administration to the heartland of America. Get it out of DC. And if you do that, you will get rid of that culture. But where it sits right now, that culture is never going to change. That administration is for America. This is an America problem in entitlements through the out years, and it shouldn't be political.
Okay.
It needs to be in the heartland.
Let me interrupt. Secretary McHugh.
Yeah, on the baseline issue, I'm not sure where you got your data, but let me speak for the Army. We are complying, and in fact, we comply with more than just a pre-deployment baseline. We do at least 2 behavioral health analysis and updates while you're in theater. We do an immediate upon return, and we do at least 2 more post-deployment. It's a very important part of trying to keep track of the issues that we've all talked about here this morning. I would be shocked if the other services are not complying in at least equal measure, but I really can't speak to those directly. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan 26 times. Never seen the instance that you described of 2 planes, two ways out. If anybody were ever to provide details on that, and Pete Corelli, in his role as Vice Chief of Staff, had the responsibility to hold senior commanders directly responsible, I would hope he'd agree we would remove that commander in a heartbeat. But in a world where people are highly prone, thankfully, to complain, I've never seen that kind of complaint. There's no question that there are always issues with the record being as fulsome as probably we would all like. There's a real concern to exfil all wounded warriors, to get them to the better care that's generally provided in Landstuhl, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that's not happening at the cost of doing the proper background material, but if those things are specifically pointed out to us, I promise you we'll act on that.
Okay, we have time for, yes, sorry.
I would support, I think General Shinseki is probably the finest Secretary of the VA we've ever had. I find him to be absolutely amazing and really trying to do the right things. I would disagree with you. I would totally agree with Secretary McHugh. I will tell you the Army does a baseline before everyone deploys. It's called the ANAN. But you look at the ANAN as something that is definitive, and it's not. The problem with the ANAN, it is so inaccurate that one of the problems we had is when we brought soldiers back and we ran them through their post-ANAN, we were getting so many false positives that they had problems from the ANAN, and I could go on infinitum and tell you the reasons why, that we were using up our precious behavioral health assets at clearing false positives, and it was a very poor indicator by itself that a soldier had a problem. So I would argue that these tools are so primitive, we really need to get to a point where they are much, much more accurate in allowing us to find out what exactly is the matter with that service member.
Well, I'm being told we're out of time. This is a discussion that needs to continue, and I want to thank our panelists for being with us here today. And I want to thank you for joining us. And if you have more questions, I'm sure you'll be able to find our panelists later during the day. But thank you again for being here with us. And thank you, General Dempsey.